Let me tell you something that should make every basketball fan sit up straight and pay attention. What happened with Caitlin Clark and Team USA isn't just a story about a lineup change. It's a case study in what happens when common sense walks into a room full of overthinking and decides to clean house. Sarcastic, and the aftermath? It's uncomfortable for a lot of people who probably wish we'd all just forget about it. But we're not going to forget about it, because this story matters. It matters for the future of women's basketball, it matters for coaching philosophy, and it matters for every person who has ever watched a decision-maker hesitate their way into a disaster while the obvious solution sat right in front of their face. Sighs. So let's break this down. Let's go through exactly what happened, why it happened, and why the conclusion was so painfully predictable that it almost feels like the universe was teaching a lesson in real time. Curious. Let's rewind to where this all started going sideways. When Kara Lawson had the reins, there was this strange energy surrounding the team. Caitlin Clark was there. Everyone knew she was there. The basketball world knew what she could do. Her skill set wasn't a secret hidden in some classified document. It was on display every single game she played. We're talking about one of the most naturally gifted playmakers to ever step on a court. Vision, court awareness. The ability to control tempo like she's got a remote control for the entire game. This isn't hyperbole, this is just what she does. And yet, somehow, starting her became this philosophical debate. It became this rotating puzzle that nobody seemed willing to solve. Every game turned into a guessing game. Would she start? Would she come off the bench? Was there some grand strategy at work that mere mortals couldn't comprehend? Fans tried to be patient, and that, as always, was the first mistake. They told themselves there must be some hidden genius at play, some master plan unfolding in the shadows, some 12-dimensional chess being played that would all make sense when the championships started rolling in. Instead, what they got was confusion dressed up as strategy. They got hesitation wearing a coaching blazer. They got a team that looked like it wasn't sure what it wanted to be because the person making decisions seemed unable to commit to the most obvious answer on the whiteboard. Here's the thing about coaching at any level. Clarity is currency. When players know their roles, when they understand the system, when there's no ambiguity about who's running the show, everything flows. But when the lineup feels like an experiment that changes based on the day of the week, that uncertainty bleeds into everything. It affects confidence. It affects chemistry. It affects the very foundation that winning teams are built on. And here's what made it even more awkward. While all this dancing around was happening, Caitlin Clark kept being good, not occasionally useful, not situationally effective, consistently, undeniably, frustratingly good. Good in a way that forced the question nobody seemed willing to answer. Why is this even a conversation? Let me paint you a picture. Imagine owning a sports car. Not just any sports car, but one of those machines that makes engineers weep with joy. And instead of driving it, you decide to push it uphill, just to prove you don't need the engine, just to demonstrate that the car can move without turning the key. That's what this felt like. That's what fans were watching. That's what was happening night after night while the basketball world scratched its collective head. The more games that passed, the louder the conversation became. And it stopped being about basketball rotations pretty quickly. It became about whether there was any plan at all. And once that question enters the arena, it doesn't leave quietly. It sits in the front row and heckles. It becomes the storyline that overshadows everything else. Social media turned into a courtroom. Every lineup decision was dissected, analyzed, and debated like it was evidence in a trial. The arguments weren't subtle disagreements about strategy anymore. They were full-blown frustrations. They were people looking at something obvious and wondering why the person in charge seemed to be the only one who couldn't see it. And then the tone shifted. From confusion to impatience, from impatience to something much sharper, something that starts pointing fingers and demanding answers, something that doesn't go away with a single win or a nice post-game interview. Because here's the brutal truth about sports. When results don't match expectations, fans look for accountability. The spotlight doesn't stay on the players forever. It moves, it finds the person making the calls. And suddenly, Kara Lawson wasn't just a respected coach navigating a difficult situation. She was the center of a debate that grew louder by the day. People weren't just questioning her decisions, they were questioning whether she should still be making them. That's the pressure cooker that was building when Nate Tibbetts walked in. And this is where the story takes a turn that almost feels scripted for dramatic effect. Because sometimes all it takes is one person entering a room, looking around, and deciding they're not going to participate in the confusion. No philosophical debates. No more treating an obvious answer like it's a controversial experiment. No more hesitation disguised as strategy. No more rotating door of indecision that leaves everyone guessing, including the players themselves. Nate Tibbetts stepped in, looked at the roster, and did something that felt revolutionary simply because nobody else had fully committed to it. He started Caitlin Clark immediately. No build-up, no suspense, no overthinking, no weeks of evaluation to determine what anyone with functioning eyes could see in 5 minutes. And just like that, the entire dynamic shifted. The offense found rhythm. The spacing made sense. Possessions stopped looking like group projects with no clear leader. Everything started flowing through a player who thrives on controlling tempo, reading defenses, and creating opportunities that most players don't even see. The ball movement had purpose. The plays had intention. The identity that had been missing suddenly appeared like it had been waiting in the hallway the whole time, just hoping someone would open the door. And here's the part that makes everything before look even worse. It worked immediately. There was no dramatic learning curve, no chaotic adjustment period, no weeks of figuring things out while analysts made excuses about chemistry needing time. It just clicked. The team looked like a team. The plays looked intentional. The whole operation transformed from scattered to synchronized practically overnight. Which, of course, raises the question that lingers like a bad smell that won't leave the room. Why did it take so long? The games themselves started answering that question louder than any analyst could. With Caitlin Clark running the show from the opening tip, Team USA didn't just win. They looked like a team that finally understood itself. The ball moved with purpose. The pace felt intentional. Defenders found themselves in positions they didn't want to be in, and it wasn't about forcing the spotlight onto one player. It was about how naturally the spotlight found her when the system actually allowed her to operate the way she's built to operate. One coach treated the situation like a puzzle with too many pieces. The other treated it like a puzzle that was already solved. The results spoke accordingly, and they spoke loudly enough that everyone could hear whether they wanted to or not. Wins started stacking. Performances became consistent. The conversation around Caitlin Clark shifted from potential to dominance. She wasn't just contributing, she was dictating. She was shaping the flow of games in a way that made everything around her more efficient. Teammates looked more comfortable because they knew what to expect. Plays looked more intentional because there was a clear engine driving them. The entire team benefited from a decision that, in hindsight, felt almost embarrassingly obvious. And then came the moment that tied the whole saga together with a bow made of pure irony. MVP. After all the hesitation, after all the debates, after all the careful dancing around a decision that should have been straightforward, the player at the center of it all did exactly what people expected her to do from the beginning. She proved it. She ended up on top. Not just figuratively, but officially. The hardware matched what the eyes had been seeing all along. Think about that for a second. All that uncertainty, all that noise, all that time spent treating an obvious answer like it was some complicated equation requiring months of calculation, and the conclusion was the same one people had been pointing toward from day one. The only difference was how long it took to get there and how much unnecessary turbulence filled the journey. Nate Tibbetts didn't reinvent basketball. He didn't uncover some hidden truth that nobody else could see. He didn't bring in some revolutionary system that changed the game. He simply trusted what was already in front of him and acted on it without hesitation, which in this case turned out to be the most effective strategy of all. He removed the one thing that had been holding everything back: doubt. And once doubt is removed from a system, confidence doesn't just appear. It spreads. It infects everything in the best possible way. You could see it in the way teammates moved without second guessing. You could see it in the way plays developed with purpose instead of hesitation. You could see it in the way Caitlin Clark carried herself as the undisputed engine of the team. No more looking over the shoulder. No more wondering if the role would shift mid-game based on some unfathomable criteria. Just clarity from start to finish. Meanwhile, the shadow of what came before continues to linger. The earlier uncertainty surrounding Kara Lawson doesn't disappear just because the story moved forward. It stays in the background because of what it represented. It wasn't just about whether to start one player. It was about the inability to fully commit to something that seemed obvious to everyone watching. It was about treating a straightforward decision like it was loaded with complexity that didn't actually exist. In sports, hesitation has a way of becoming the loudest mistake of all. Fans remember it. They replay it. They turn it into debates that refuse to go away quietly. So when people started calling for changes, when they began questioning whether Lawson should still be in charge, it wasn't coming from nowhere. It was the natural outcome of a gap between expectation and execution that became impossible to ignore. Because once you see what works, you cannot unsee it. And once Tibbetts showed what happens when you remove the hesitation, everything else starts to look like unnecessary delay. Everything that came before starts looking like time wasted for no good reason. The most uncomfortable part of this whole situation: how quickly the previous approach collapsed the moment clarity entered the room. The same roster, the same talent, the same expectations, suddenly sharper, faster, and far more organized. It was like watching someone finally turn on the lights after everyone had been stumbling around in the dark. The question practically asked itself, what exactly were they waiting for? It's one thing to make a bold decision that doesn't pan out. At least that comes with conviction. At least you can respect the courage to try something different, even if it fails. It's a completely different situation when the issue is hesitation itself, when indecision becomes the defining characteristic, when avoidance disguises itself as patience and careful evaluation, and avoidance doesn't survive winning. That's the brutal simplicity of it all. Winning simplifies everything. Losing complicates everything. The contrast between the two approaches was so clean, it almost felt scripted for maximum dramatic impact. What made it even more striking was how natural everything looked once the decision was made. There was no sense of forcing a system around Caitlin Clark because she is the system when she's allowed to be. The ball found her. The pace adjusted to her. The entire identity of the team shifted from scattered to synchronized without needing a dramatic overhaul or weeks of adjustment. It wasn't a transformation. It was a correction. And corrections tend to raise uncomfortable questions about why things were off in the first place. Questions that don't have good answers. Questions that leave people squirming in their seats during post-game press conferences. That's why the conversation around what happened before doesn't fade quietly. Success under a new approach doesn't erase the memory of confusion under the old one. If anything, it sharpens the contrast. It makes the before look worse because the after looks so much better. People keep circling back, replaying those earlier decisions, wondering how something so obvious managed to become so complicated in the hands of people who are supposed to be experts. Some called it overthinking. Others called it mismanagement. A growing number simply called for change and moved on with their opinions fully formed. Because in a results-driven environment, perception matters almost as much as performance, and the perception had already crystallized. It no longer looked like a team experimenting its way toward greatness. It looked like a team that succeeded the exact moment it stopped experimenting and started committing. In the end, Caitlin Clark didn't just rise above the noise, she turned the noise into background music for a performance that felt inevitable all along. The debates, the hesitation, the second-guessing, all of it became part of a storyline that ultimately led to the same conclusion people had been pointing toward from the beginning. All those complications and controversies just became footnotes in a story that was always heading toward the same destination. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden. Sometimes it's just ignored until someone decides to stop ignoring it. And in this case, the moment that happened, everything changed. The fog lifted, the path cleared, and the results followed immediately. Start the player who makes everything better. It sounds obvious because it is obvious. And yet it took a complete shift in approach for that obvious choice to finally take center stage. It took a change in leadership for the most straightforward decision in basketball to actually get made. The lesson is sitting right there for anyone willing to see it. Trust your eyes, trust your evidence, trust the player who was built for exactly this moment, and stop treating clarity like it's something to be afraid of. Stop turning simple answers into complex debates that serve no one. Because at the end of the day, what we witnessed wasn't just a coaching change producing better results. It was a demonstration of what happens when someone in charge finally decides to stop overthinking and start acting on what everyone already knew. The validation came in the form of wins, it came in the form of dominant performances, and it came in the form of MVP hardware that put the final punctuation mark on a story that should have been straightforward from the beginning. Tell me what you think in the comments. Was the earlier hesitation justified, or was this always going to end the same way? Was there ever a legitimate reason to treat the obvious answer like a mystery? Make sure you like. Make sure you subscribe. Because stories like this don't just end, they echo. And this one is going to echo for a long time. Every time a coach hesitates on an obvious decision, people are going to remember what happened here. Every time someone overthinks themselves into a corner, this story is going to come up. That's the legacy of what we just witnessed. Not just a player proving herself, but a reminder that sometimes the right answer is the simple one, and the only mistake is waiting too long to act on it.